So yeah, I guess you could say I sort of decided to take a focus in insular Southeast Asia, which is primarily Austronesia, doing through the third year of my undergraduate degree. And so I approached it from the standpoint of culture, since I was doing the degree in anthropology. But obviously, I also wanted to understand it from a linguistic standpoint. So all of my work was like, anthro-linguistic and whatnot in the Austronesian world. And actually, I decided that Indonesian was going to be, the language that I picked to really sort of hone all of my skills into. Um, just sort of, what I would focus on. Actually, it was kind of random. I was looking for, I don't know, I just wanted a cool language to study. And one summer, I was just kind of bored, and I was on Amazon.com, and I was looking at Tagalog and, Ilocano, which was actually, what was that? That summer that I was there, Ilocano um, was the language used in the language and culture course, there.
Okay, yeah.
So,
With
that
with
also
Esther.
played, yeah,
With
with Espree,
yeah,
exactly.
okay.
So that
Yeah.
also sort of played into the whole Austronesian thing.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I was just sort of randomly on the internet. I ran across Indonesian, and I figured, that would be a really cool language to learn. Just looked up a couple sound files and whatnot, and absolutely fell in love with it. So, I bought a textbook, started studying the history, the language, the culture, got the opportunity to do field work there, and so yeah, I've been studying, insular Southeast Asia through the Indonesian lens ever since. Um, so that's just sort of a little bit of background. But as far as
Mhm.
Indonesian and Malay, the difference between the two is probably compared. You're probably able to compare that to the difference between American English and British English. Um, and it's a very interesting history. Both dialects, from what I understand, are based on the historical Riau dialect of Malay, which is classical Malay. So a lot of the early pieces of Malay literature were written in this classical dialect that sometimes people call Riau Malay. Both Malaysian Malay and Indonesian Malay, or Bahasa Indonesia Indonesian,
Mhm.
uh, they're both based on that. Because of just sort of, and this is where I guess maybe language contact comes in a bit, and also historical forces. You have more Dutch words in Indonesian, and then you have more English words in Malay of Malaysia, simply because the British were in power during the colonial period in Malaysia, and the Dutch they basically had control of the rest of the archipelago, which became Indonesia. So you sort of see that. Also, at least on the Indonesian side of things, you're not getting sort of this pure, I hate to use that term, but almost like a refined you're not getting a direct descendant of that classical Malay
Yeah.
tradition. You're also getting a lot of variations, sort of city idiosyncratically added by various Indonesian authors and Chinese authors that been in the region for a really long time. Now, the term sort of that is used for what you would call a Chinese person that their family's always been in Indonesia, peranakan. Um, so essentially, the Peranakan and various other authors throughout the archipelago, uh, their literary forms have added to modern Indonesian, and also various versions of Malay used throughout the archipelago. Because this is where you have this other historical force there. Um, this whole sort of region was an immense hub of trade for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Mhm.
That sort of you get Indian traders coming from South Asia. You get the Chinese coming, and then later, of course, you get the Portuguese, the British, and the Dutch, especially focusing on the Spice Islands. if you know any sort of the history behind that, uh, sort of the Dutch sort of occupying this whole area. One of the interesting facts about that is the island of Manhattan, in what was that sort of New York area that used to be, I think it was New Amsterdam, the
Right.
name of it.
Right.
That was all traded in order to obtain the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, here
Mm.
in Indonesia. And also you have tons of indigenous groups that are indigenous to the land here, autochthonous to the land here, that were trading in between islands as well. And sort of the lingua franca for the entire archipelago was Malay in its various versions. So you get local dialects of Malay. You had local dialects of Malay everywhere. And one of the more prominent dialects of Malay that's still used is the one in the Papuan region, known as Papuan Malay. And so, that when you sort of get to New Guinea, you're beginning to go into another culture, cultural area. The linguistics begins to be quite different, but especially on those coastal regions, you still have there are people who speak Austronesian languages, and one of them is the Papuan Malay.
Oh,
So
interesting.
yeah, all of those different versions. Yeah, so all of those different versions of Malay sort of added something to the pool of Indonesian. And then after 1945, when Sukarno, basically that was Indonesia's first president, declared independence from the Dutch, they decided that they were going to have one language for the entire archipelago, and that was going to be the Indonesian version of Malay. So they basically they took all these different things, put it together, and standardized it into what would become sort of the national language for the region.
Okay. And when they
Um,
when they say Bahasa
so yeah,
Indonesia, that's the language they're talking about is post 1945 kind of standardization and
yeah,
codification of a
exactly.
national
So yeah,
language.
the word,
Hmm.
yeah, exactly, precisely, yeah. One thing to I just mentioned, so Bahasa of course means language, and but the word Bahasa itself is really interesting because it kind of shows sort of that history I was telling you about, sort of this being a hot spot for trade and commerce historically. Bahasa is actually a word that comes from Sanskrit. So if you
Mm.
look at Hindi, or if you studied Bangla, I just came from Bangladesh, so I was studying Bengali or Bangla there. Don't ask me to speak it.
Yeah.
I'm able to get around, a bit with it. Uh, you had that exact same word there, bhasha, and so that word and a slew of other words, especially through Sanskrit, Hindu, and Buddhist texts, were carried over to the archipelago and have heavily influenced Malay, and then what would become Indonesian, or Bahasa Indonesia, literally
Yeah.
the language of Indonesia. So,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So and what I think is interesting about Austronesian is before I guess even just thought about like all the trade and all the different influences going on in like Malaysia, Indonesia, your area, uh, kind of my thought was, it must work a lot like Polynesian, where Polynesian you have abrupt splits, you have really long distance migrations, you have very little contact after splits, and so it's like one of the only kind of language subfamilies where the tree model actually works really well. Like right where like the abrupt splits that tree implies actually happen. But it seems like your side of things, the Malaysian branch, should I call it the Malaysian branch? Yeah, the Malaysian branch is like it's not that way at all. There's like loads of continued contact and remergers, and you can't draw a tree of that, can you?
yeah, it would be extremely difficult. It's sort of this whole process of divergence and convergence, over and over again historically. So yeah, it would be extremely difficult to say, it's only one thing, and this is sort of the straightforward historical trajectory that it took, because there's just so much going on in the region historically. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think that would be accurate.
Yeah, so you had mentioned something about Uh, genetic evidence. Now, genetic evidence for. I mean, are we just talking about homeland for Austronesian, or?
Um, a little. Well, actually, what let's see. I guess I don't necessarily mean it in the hard sort of linguistic sense,
Uh-huh.
but sort of in the true biological sense, just
Right.
as sort of something that another piece of evidence that tells us about the culture history of the region. So if you, uh, yeah, let's see how to where to begin. Actually, I'll start with Bali. Bali is extreme, really popular tourist spot. Many people tend to know it, but its history is really interesting, and the gene pool there is really interesting as well. It sort of demonstrates this whole thing that I've been telling you about, the archipelago, Austronesian archipelago, if you will, being a hotspot for trade. So in Bali, you definitely do have the genes of what would be the Austronesians that came out of South China, but you also have tons and tons of Indic genetic material, up to about 12%, which is quite significant. 12% of the gene pool in Bali comes from um, the Indian subcontinent,
Mm-hmm.
and it also just so happens to be one of the spots where most of Indonesia is Muslim, but Bali is predominantly Hindu. Of course, there's a lot of Buddhist activities there. I guess you could sort of put that under the umbrella of Indicization, Indic civilization, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And Bali is often used an example of what Indonesia was like before the advent of Islam. I thought it was really interesting that even within their gene pool, not just Bali, those genes are everywhere throughout the archipelago. You find Indian genes, genes from the Middle East with the coming of Islam, various traders. You get the Dutch, the Portuguese genes, obviously the Austronesian genes. Actually, a ton of the Papuan genes. The further you go east, the more you get Papuan genes in sort of the distribution of genetic material throughout the archipelago. So in the eastern part. So it's really interesting that not only the language and some of the culture that we're able to see through various forms of syncretism. So even though the archipelago is primarily Muslim, it doesn't really occur to people that there are still very Buddhist and very Hindu elements to Indonesian culture. So,
Mm.
for example, everyone, no matter who you are, they participate in the Balinese dance tradition, which enacts the old Hindu stories, the Ramayana, Mahabharata, whatnot. Um, the official airline for Indonesia is a good example. Is Garuda, which is one of the old Hindu gods. There's still sort of this whole, and of course, also pre-Indic religions, aspects of civilization are here through adat performances and whatnot, which are various shrine and local based forms of religion that you can see throughout. So it's interesting that sort of the mixture and the complexity of the gene pool of the history is something that we also see in language. And yeah, it makes it extremely difficult to really sort of map this out in any straightforward kind of way as you can do in the other parts of the Austronesian world.
Okay. Yeah, so for those who haven't been yet disabused of the notion that Asia is like a monolithic culture, here we see like so, so much like this precedes this precedes Western kind of multiculturalism by a good bit. But,
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, especially Indonesia. What is it? Over 400 languages, tons of cultures, and those things that we call cultures, of course, are these sort of large constellation of like related cultures,
Yeah.
which you could really break down, to their own individual cultural elements in many ways. So yeah, like you go in Java, we talk about Javanese culture, but and this is something you see with the language as well. You go to Central Java, it's a very different feel from being in Western Java. Among the Betawi, for instance, in the native people of Jakarta, there was one Javanese group. Then you get to Central Java, and that was sort of the heart of what was once a Javanese kingdom. It's a very, very different feel, very different type of culture. The same thing for East Java. The people, their culture is quite distinct. Their traditions are quite distinct, even though they're related. So yeah, it's really interesting that we sort of, it's almost just trying to find the dividing line between what we would call a language and a dialect. Sort of when should we draw that line? You have that same problem with culture. So
Mm. So you're probably gonna want to get to bed pretty soon. It's 8:40 for me, but it's 20 to midnight for you. But um,
yeah, no worries. Ask as many questions. I've got time. So I've made time for this. No worries.
okay. Oh, thank you. Uh, okay, two more
Yeah.
questions I definitely want to get in. Related questions. One, have you tried Kopi Luwak? And number two, how
No,
does? No, you haven't. Get on that.
no. Kopi Luwak.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tell us what Kopi Luwak
Okay.
is. Do you know Kopi
Sorry.
Luwak? You know Kopi Luwak?
Actually, no, I'm not familiar with it. What is it?
Oh, okay. Kopi Luwak is coffee beans that have been processed by a luwak, which I believe in English we maybe call it a
Ah,
servant.
I remember.
Okay,
Okay.
there we go.
Yeah. Okay.
Poop
We'll see.
coffee.
We'll see.
It's
Yeah,
it's
exactly. We'll
incredibly
see.
expensive to get it over here. I've never tried it because it's so expensive, but I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
it's cheaper to find it there. From Bali, I think.
Okay.
Anyways,
Okay.
the related question. Um, so, what does your field work look like there? Are you like you gathering word lists? Are you visiting dialects, or what? What's the advantage
Okay.
of being in Indonesia for your research here?
Okay. So yeah, my research is a bit unconventional. There are very few people who sort of um, I'd say, especially in the field of linguistics, there are very few people that have decided to do this sort of work. It's very much so more characteristic of anthropology,
Mm,
and in sort of a formal way, still, um, it's still something that you don't. It's not as much done as you would think it should be. So in anthropology, you get all these reflections on the field itself, um, but sort of in a systematic, almost studying how the field works in a very ethnographic, very detailed way is not something you find as much. Uh, and you definitely don't find it in linguistics.
mm-hmm,
So basically, what I'm studying uh, boils down to this concept of an epistemic culture. The whole idea is that various academic disciplines and fields have a culture by which they produce knowledge, and it sort of uh, I wouldn't say dictates, but it definitely guides what you can say, what you can think, and how your field functions and why it performs the work it does. Um, and so I decided to take that approach to linguistics, specifically the area of language documentation as it relates to language conservation, which are, of course, two sort of separate things. You can document a language that's not about to die. You can choose any sort of language in the world. It could be that it's not facing language death, but you could just simply want to write a grammar or dictionary on it. And then you have those dying languages where you have to really go out and find a way to preserve, those languages. So I decided to really take a hard look at that, since that's sort of what I want to get into. Hopefully when I get there to Ken IL, I can to be equipped with the skills to perform that sort of work, writing with grammar and dictionary, and preferably for one of the languages that sort of are in dire need of it. So, but sort of before approaching that, before getting into documenting the language, I sort of wanted to reflect on what it meant, especially in sort of this globalized world, sort of what some people think of as like the post-colonial world, and just sort of as a science itself, what does all this actually mean? What does all this actually do? And also it sort of connects on a personal level to wanting to find out whether my work would actually help the people, whose language I would be documenting or whatnot. Because you hear all this rhetoric of the savior linguist sort of going out and documenting these languages for various indigenous groups, and and sort of there are all these potentials that they give for why this is a good idea, but I hadn't really heard of very many things actually being realized. Of course, it's a bit different. I guess you can't. I wouldn't completely say that there's no good coming out of it at all. Obviously, living in North America, we can actually see the good that can come out of language documentation, where various Native Americans, as we call them in the United States, or First Nations people, First Nations in Canada, are taking those languages and using that in within their ethnicity, bringing back those languages out. Gaelic and various other languages were sort of brought back in a way. But besides that, I just was sort of curious to what were sort of the concrete things that, what does linguistics actually do for people? Why should we be doing this work? And what are better ways that the field of linguistics can operate so that I guess we're doing our best to really contribute something to humanity. And so it's really interesting because it's not so much me going out and doing documentation work itself, but really going to institutions, talking to linguists, sort of observing almost like documenting their process of documentation, and sort of understanding in these various contexts how they carry out their work, how different countries, different linguists from different countries carry out their work, and so the complexity of that and the effects of that. So yeah, that's my work, and it's primarily as far as methodology, it revolves around the ethnographic interview, and just basically the examining of various institutions, and just seeing how they work to preserve indigenous languages, specifically those that are on the brink of the language death. So yeah, one, I guess, just sort of one quick example, somewhat thorough example I can give is, I just finished the project that I had in Bangladesh, and understanding some of the complexities of language documentation there are really interesting. First of all, when I landed there, it was kind of disappointing because I found out there were no current language documentation projects underway. Not at all. But it was interesting to see what the country and the academics there, the ways they were contributing to language documentation and preservation throughout the world, primarily through their history and the creation of the International Mother Tongue Day by UNESCO through their history. So the 21st of February is the International Mother Tongue Day, and it's all about preserving the right to speak your mother tongue. That date was chosen, the 21st of February, because it just so happens to be the date of the martyrs during the Bangladeshi language movement. And this was this whole movement in the late 40s, early 50s in Bangladesh to preserve the right to speak Bengali when Bangladesh was actually part of Pakistan. So maybe I have to sort of explain a little bit about that history. Yeah, after British, at the end of British colonialism,
Hmm.
uh, the Indian subcontinent was split into two. India, which would become the primarily Hindu state, and then Pakistan, which would be primarily the Muslim state. And so since the area which was then the East Bengal region was primarily Muslim, so that was lumped into Pakistan.
Yeah,
Uh,
East
Many of the
Bengal was part
theories,
of Pakistan originally during that time.
yeah,
Not for long though,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
It sounds
No,
ridiculous, but
no, no. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, because it's like there's like 1,000 miles of land in
yeah.
between what was then Pakistan and today Bangladesh. And it's crazy that they were considered one country.
Hmm.
It's sort of almost yeah, but yeah, that was the main idea. And for most people, that was pretty sound at the time. But it was just simply that, especially for the people in the East Bengal region, they were upset by what was chosen to be the national language, and that was Urdu, this language that was put up on a pedestal for being the language of Islam, because it's written in the Arabic script.
Hmm.
It carries a lot of prestige, especially in what was in the West Pakistan area. So East Bengal was known as East Pakistan, and then West Bengal is what we have with Pakistan today. And and so, yeah, and people were really upset that it was chosen above Bengali or Bangla. One, because people in the Bengalis were the majority, the ethnic majority of about 55%. Also, their literary tradition. It's one of the oldest literary traditions in South Asia. Um, and they felt like they had a right to have their native tongue used throughout the country in various institutions and whatnot. And so they weren't completely against Urdu. They just wanted Bengali to be one of the state languages as well. But obviously, Pakistani government wasn't going to have that. They felt for some reason that with one nation, with one language, that language is going to be the prestigious one, Urdu. Um, so there were many student protests and whatnot in the East Bengal region, which led to this sort of explosion on the 21st of February. And we have tons of martyrs, Bengali martyrs that come that were killed in that on that day. And so sort of that day is used to commemorate the martyrs, the language movement, and the base, and actually this whole like language movement served as the base for Bangladeshi nationalism. So it's interesting. The country is founded on this whole idea of being able to speak your mother tongue and the use of an indigenous tongue. Uh, so yeah, I found that really interesting,
Mm.
and so yeah, they made that sort of world contribution uh, through having 21st of February, the International Mother Tongue Day. But also it was really interesting too because sort of that whole it was the foundation of their whole sort of nationalist ideology. Um, it also contributes to how they think about preserving their own indigenous languages, which is um, unfortunately, it's studied by the fact there's not very many resources, especially in terms of funding. But they are setting up the infrastructure to do language documentation throughout their country, and so yeah, it was just a really interesting perspective on language documentation, how it, and sort of the history of it, and how it's carried out in different contexts. So that's just sort of an example of what I mean by sort of examining the epistemic culture of linguistics, specifically language documentation. And that's the work that I'm carrying out in about 8 countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So,
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. I didn't. An epistemic culture that goes so broad that I could sit here and talk. I wish we could sit here and talk all day about it. There's philosophical implications as well as the practical implications there, but all day for me would be all night for you, so we won't do that. Let's let you get to bed. And do you want to give a shout out to your funders in case this goes massively viral?
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, honestly, I'd like to start with thanking all the people at KNIL actually for my time there and what I learned in linguistics, and sort of like what I talked about in the beginning, being guided to Austronesian studies, through the school. So, just a thanks and a shout out to everyone there. Um, uh, I'd like to thank everyone at Sewanee University in the South. That was where I did my undergraduate degree, and that was home for me for 4 years, and couldn't have done it without the training and nurturing that I received there. And of course, specifically my funders, the Thomas J. Watson Foundation, for providing me this opportunity to spend a wonderful year traveling and doing field work in an area that I love. So, thank you.
Right on. Even though Suwannee to me sounds like a pig call, like you're calling in the pigs. I hear good things
Yeah,
though.
we
I hear good
actually,
things.
we're a pretty rural school. Yeah, it's a great school, but yeah, it's a rural. We didn't have any pigs.